Welcome everyone to our policing panel, Black and Blue, the persistent problem between the African American community and police gun violence. We have a very distinguished panel here today, I'm pleased to say. And so the way that we want to structure this program, they're going to give individual presentations and then we're going to open it up for questions. Because of who we have here today, we're not just going to be talking about the issue that we know exists. We want to also be solution focused. So if you could tailor your questions to that, and if the panelists could be mindful of solutions that they have in mind or things that they might want to see achieved in their opinions, that would be great. My name is Angela Scott. I am a civil rights attorney with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I am a former prosecutor with the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, and I'm currently the secretary of the Civil Rights and Social Justice section of the American Bar Association. So we really appreciate you being here. Our first panelist is Will Jawando. He is a county councilman in Montgomery County. In addition to that, he's an attorney, activist, community leader with a lifelong dedication to public service. His career has been crafted by a unique combination of grit, compassion, and integrity. He was born to a Nigerian father and a white Kansas mother in Silver Spring. Sounds kind of familiar, a little bit. His biracial identity gives him an appreciation for the varied experiences of life in that America can bring. Raised in a low-income household, he was determined to secure a successful future for himself through the pathway of education. Will actually attended my law school, CUA, Columbus School of Law. We, however, know each other through serving on a community board together, the Clarence D. Burns Association in Baltimore City. Will is a regular commentary for MSNBC and cable news. He's fast becoming a voice of authority on issues surrounding the nation's political climate, public policy, and social justice. And he's been featured in an array of national media outlets, including MSNBC News, New York Times, The Washington Post, NPR, MTV, and New York Magazine. He is a devoted husband and father of 3 beautiful girls and now 1 boy. So I'm going to welcome him to the podium, and he's going to talk briefly from his perspective. Okay.
Thank you, Angela, and it's just awesome to see you in this role, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this all-star panel. Good afternoon, everybody. In addition to Angela said, I civil rights lawyer as well, and I worked in the Obama White House Department of Education and on Capitol Hill for about 10 years in various offices before a stint at Discovery Communications, but grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I live now, and I represent, I'm an at-large member of the council where I represent 1.1 million people in Montgomery County, which is our state's largest county, but I know we have other county folks here, so I'm not going to say best county. I'll say state, I'll stick to the facts. It's great to be here today. The topic is obviously, there we go. I have one of these in front of me a lot, so there we go. The topic's obviously an important one. We're in a new era of policing and criminal justice in our country. I know you all know that. And I want to frame the conversation, and I'll get to some of the things I've been working on and how I think and be solutions oriented. But I think we have to ask ourselves in these serious cases, we vest in our police and our law enforcement a significant power, right? It's the power to deprive people of liberty. It's the power to use force. It's the power to, in some circumstances, take life. And we do it all for a very simple reason. We do it because we want them to keep us safe as a community, and we want to be able to operate and have a good quality of life. So they're there to protect and serve. And I think it's important to start there when you have these discussions, because the power that is vested in the police comes from the people, just like the power or like the officials or anyone else. And so when we approach this conversation, I think we need to approach it from a vantage of, we've given the power, so it's appropriate, certainly where we are today, to talk about, is that power being exercised in the way it should be? And are there limits to that power, and what should they be? And when should they apply? And I think often we get in this conversation that we skip that part. Brian Stevenson, who you all know, talks about, do we deserve as a society to kill people? And he normally is talking about it in the context of the death penalty. I think there's a strong argument that when 1 in 9 people who are killed, 1 in 9 death penalty sentences, rather, are exonerated, that's not a really good track record. I know we're not here to talk about death penalty, but I think you can apply this to the police killing situation. If you got on a plane, they say 1 in 9 of you aren't going to make it. That's not a good odds. And I think, so that question of when can life be taken by the state and when is it justified is a serious question. We obviously have serious issues with criminal justice overall, right? That we know that 1 in 3 black males, give or take on the year, are either in jail or prison or under some probation or parole. In cities like Baltimore and New York and other places, that can be over 55% of the population, black males between 18 and 30, that are either in prison, in jail, or under probation or parole. And so we know that interactions that African Americans and people of color have with police, more often than not, have the ability to end in a negative outcome for that resident. And I say negative outcome because it could range from having, getting a ticket or a fine that you're not able to pay, to being arrested or incarcerated, to obviously, in the case that we're talking about today, having your life taken, right? And so these are serious outcomes, and we know disproportionately that it happens for people of color in that way. And so I'm telling you things I know you already know, but I just think it's important to frame why this is such an important discussion, and that how we have to embrace and kind of gird it in that every human life has dignity. And that when it is taken and how it's taken and the circumstances surrounding that need to be analyzed and have a high level of scrutiny. Because that's the ultimate, life lived in pursuit of happiness. Life is the ultimate of what we hold in our society as one of your kind of God-given rights and your basic rights. And so I'm just coming today, I'm going to break a little news here at the ABA panel. I introduced my first bill called the Law Enforcement Trust and Transparency Act on Martin Luther King's birthday, January 15th, that would require independent police investigations and public reporting of the investigative report in the case of police-involved death. That bill was introduced. It was co-sponsored by all 8 of my colleagues. We have a 9-member county council. It has gone through 2 work sessions in the Public Safety Committee, the one of which I just came from, and was just passed out of the Public Safety Committee this morning, about an hour and a half ago. And so we'll head to the full council for a vote probably May 7th. And so it's exciting for me, and then that it's my first bill, but it's also, I think, an example of the type of progress I wanted to talk about briefly here. And just tell me I have like 2 minutes if I'm going long. I won't go too long. One of the things that prompted me to introduce this bill, other than living 35 plus years as a black man in America, was the shooting of an unarmed man in Silver Spring, where I live, Robert White, about 10 months ago. He was walking in his neighborhood, a walk that he did every day, and was noticed by a police officer who was clearing a 911 hang-up call. So he wasn't there in the area responding to anything. It was someone who called 911 hung up. He had cleared, checked it out, nothing happened. He was heading back to his car and was getting ready to pull off. And all we know based on his testimony through his lawyer was that he observed Mr. White having a ripped jacket, staring at the police officer, and putting his hand in his pocket. And based on those three things, he made the decision to pursue, saying that he looked suspicious. And mind you, all three of those things I've done many, many times in my life when interacting or about to interact with a police officer. Ripped clothing is popular. It's a fashion statement now. And so he followed this gentleman. His body camera came on several minutes later, and it ended in an interaction that when Mr. White, who had mental health issues and was known to the community, after telling the police officer to leave him alone, stopped following him for about several minutes, more than 6-7 minutes, charged the officer, and the officer ended up shooting at him 7 times and killing him. And our community has been shaken by this, in that many people knew who he was. He was on his walk that he did, his daily constitutional, every day, same path, his own neighborhood where he lived. And they were wondering why a black man, 41 years old, can't walk in his neighborhood without the fear of losing his life. And one of the things I argued, we had an investigation by police into the killing, and they deemed that it was lawful and justified. You'll hear from Mr. Gibson later. His predecessor had an informal arrangement with our state's attorney to review investigations of police-involved death and determine whether there was any criminal liability. That also came back in the form of a 2-sentence letter from Howard County saying that the killing and shooting was justified without any further explanation. And so we had some significant uproar from the community, and part of what led to my bill, where we're now saying that our police should not be investigating deaths of individuals that they kill. And that's a best practice from President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force that suggests that both the police investigation and the prosecution and separate recommendations be independently done so that we can try to build and maintain community trust. And so I'm happy that it's moving forward, but it's only a small piece of what we need to do in these situations. Obviously I mentioned to you, I actually told you the drawn-out story. Why was he stopped? I've said this many times, if you can have this type of situation, if the same facts happened again, and another person was walking with a ripped jacket and put his hand in his pocket and who stared at the police officer, and that can initiate a stop that could lead to the eventual death of a resident, I think that's the wrong policy. And we need to look at the incentive structure around why are we policing the way we police. One of the things that I'm working on now is another piece of legislation that is honoring the remembrance and reconciliation of 3 African-American men who were lynched in Montgomery County. I work in a building, county council office, that used to be the county jail. And 2 of them were dragged out from the jail in the late 1800s and literally hung right in front of the building. And we have to recognize that the history of policing and law enforcement in our community is not too distant history. It's very charged, and I think the need for transparency and independence is paramount. But also the need, this is where I'll end, for community policing. And not just saying the word, we throw it around a lot. One of the things I've said over and over again, if you remember about Mr. White, he was on a walk that he did every day. But this officer whose beat was, he was on his beat, he wasn't an officer from another beat, didn't know who he was. If you're saying you're doing community policing, and you have someone who's walking a walk that they walk every day, and you don't know who he is, you're not doing your job. In many of our police stations, you have these boards, and I've seen them, and I've seen printouts of it, of the cops that get the praise. The police officers that get the praise are the ones who have the most arrests, the most stops, the most tickets, the most any type of infractions. They're not being praised for how many community meetings did you attend, how many situations did you de-escalate, what were your conversations with this segment of the community. And so I think we need to also talk about changing the incentive structure of how we define success in policing. Because we need to limit, in addition to all the implicit bias, training, and all those things, we need to fundamentally reorient how we approach policing. And so we're going to be doing some follow-up legislation that will create a police policy advisory committee, citizens advisory committee, Sacramento recently set one of these up, where it has police and community members that look at a whole range of issues and look at data in a critical way. It's staffed, like unlike police, sometimes these advisory committees are just set up and they have no staff and no resources. You have to give them resources. And it's going to look at why 55%, and I'll leave you with this number, 55%, our police just released their use of force statistics. 55% of the people arrested in 2018 were black in Montgomery County. Now, you're not from Montgomery County, we make up about 18% of the population. So 55% of the people arrested in 2018 were black. If you add Latinos into there, you get over 73% of the people arrested in 2018 in Montgomery County were black or Latino. You can look at same thing with stops, same thing with as I mentioned, arrests. So we have a systemic problem in how we police, and I think those are the next steps. Let's get transparency and accountability when a situation happens. But if we're really going to roll this back, we're going to need to look into the data of how we police so that we can limit those interactions. And then when an interaction does happen, how is it happening from a viewpoint that limits the amount of bias? And that's continual training that's going to be required. So with that, I'll pause and look forward to the questions.
And you actually raised something that is of tremendous concern to me, because I have a younger brother who is African American and autistic, and he has a walk routine, if many of you know about people with autism. And so it is very important that police within the community get to know certain individuals. I'm going to introduce our next panelist, Rich Gibson. Mr. Gibson graduated from Howard University School of Law in 2003. He's been a prosecutor for 15 years in multiple jurisdictions throughout the state of Maryland, and he's handled virtually every kind of criminal case one can handle, including homicides, police-involved shootings, gang prosecutions, human trafficking, large drug trade organizations, and sex offenses. Rich is a 2006 Maryland State Bar Association Leadership Academy Fellow, which is how we met. And he's a past president of the Waring Mitchell Law Society, which is the minority bar association for Howard County. In 2016, Rich was recognized as Prosecutor of the Year for the Mid-Atlantic region by the Mid-Atlantic Regional Gang Investigators Network. And in October of 2018, he received the Criminal Justice Reform Award by the Maryland Emerging Leaders POC. And most importantly, in November of 2018, Rich was elected to be Howard County State's Attorney, and he is the first African American to hold this position, so that's a tremendous accomplishment. He is married and has 3 wonderful children, so you're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just teased Will saying he beat me by 1 because he's got 1 more kid than I do, and I'm done. No more time. We're done. So my honor to be here today. I want to share with you some anecdotes of some of my experiences. As Angela said, I prosecuted for 15 years, and much of that time was actually spent in Baltimore. I started off in Prince George's County under Glen Ivy, and I did drug court and juvenile, drug court and district court and circuit court there. And in 2006, a colleague of mine said, if you really want to be good at prosecution, you've got to go to Baltimore, because that's where the problems are, that's where the systemic issues are, that's where the challenges are. And if you really want to be good, go to a place where it's most difficult to do it, and then try to succeed in that environment. If you can thrive there, you can thrive in any environment. And me being glutton for punishment, I decided, you know what, sounds great, about to have my first child, and I'm going to take this on. And I came to Baltimore and had my eyes open. Prince George's County has its challenges, but Baltimore City has systemic ingrained issues in that the part of it stems from the community. The community has an ingrained distrust for police and an ingrained distrust for law enforcement. And so getting cooperation and dealing with certain issues is very, very challenging. Getting witnesses to come forward is very, very challenging. And I want to be clear, the community's view of law enforcement is justified. there is a reason for that distrust, and it is based on systemic issues related to the way law enforcement communities interact with communities of color. It relates to poverty, it relates to a whole bunch of systemic issues that are driving this underlying feeling which impacts justice and the way justice is administered. I guess the analogy I would use, actually, it was from a book that I think really captured it. You can look at law enforcement, in particular police, much like the analogy is a computer. So for some people, they view police as the operating system. They're in the background, making sure things move smoothly and transition from point A to point B really, really well. For other people, an equally valid view of law enforcement is that of the pop or the virus that's popping up out of nowhere. It's scary, it's interfering with your ability to do things you want to do. It's seen as something that is intrusive and negative. And both points of view have validity. I think that is part of the issue that you deal with when you talk about the community and the community interrelates with law enforcement. I think a large part of that has to do with a system that does have, you have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, there's a systemic bias that is in place. That bias is in part based upon overt things, and it's part based upon implicit bias, the biases that we all have in our core that impact the judgments we make in everyday interactions. I think that in the law enforcement context, that systemic bias really has the opportunity to play out in negative ways. And in the most severe case, as Councilman Germano indicated, it can lead to the loss of life. I think that in order to counter systemic bias, you need to have several things. But you need to have an empathetic and open-minded policing force and empathetic and open-minded prosecutors. The reality is that the state's attorneys, the prosecutors, have the ability, if they're operating properly, to overview and review all of the action of law enforcement. We get to review their conduct. Part of our mission statement isn't just to prosecute crimes, but to ensure that police, when they interact with the community, do so in ways that are lawful, do so in ways that are consistent with the Constitution. And that is a core function of the prosecutor. And it is important to note that in our nation, most of the prosecutors are white. And that plays into, has an impact on outcomes because of, again, potential lack of empathy. By way of analogy, I'll tell a case. This wasn't my case, but it does demonstrate the issue. A colleague of mine had a case where a med student, a white med student, he lived in a house that had a detached garage. And the garage had been broken into over and over and over again. And he was frustrated. He called the police numerous times. Nothing was happening. They weren't solving the problem. This med student decided that on one night he heard noises in the back of someone messing with his shed, his detached garage. And the reason why I say it's detached is because it's legally significant. It has a legal importance. So the garage was detached. He heard noises. He called the police. And he decided, I'm going to go handle this myself. He went to the wall, and on his wall he had an ornamental samurai sword. He unsheathed the sword,